So in this video, we're going to look at Chapter 12 on blood. So blood is connective tissue. It is, and like all connective tissue, there are some cells, and there's a whole bunch of extracellular matrix. In all connective tissues, the extracellular matrix is proteins, fibers, and ground substance. In the case of blood, the proteins are globular, and the ground substance is liquid. It's blood plasma. Well, it's mostly water. So what does blood do for us? It moves things through the body. So it moves blood gases, so oxygen and nutrients to body cells, carbon dioxide and waste from body cells. The wastes go to where they're excreted. So might be the respiratory system, might be the kidneys, might be the liver, whatever. Blood is also useful at distributing heat. The circulation will take heat to the surface and help dissipate it, or by keeping blood to the core, you can keep warm. Blood also protects the body. So this is the white blood cells are for fighting infection. Platelets stop bleeding. So the blood is the fundamental part of the cardiovascular system. So blood, the heart, and the blood vessels together make up the cardiovascular system. So what's the correct mixture of all of these things? So blood plasma is the liquid part of the blood. It is water, proteins, amino acids, carbs, fats, hormones, vitamins, electrolytes, all kinds of things are found within the blood plasma, either dissolved or suspended in the blood plasma. Of the remaining, so plasma is about 55%. Of the remaining 45%, most of it is red blood cells, and that's called the hematocrit. Now, the white blood cells and the platelets make up just a small fraction of, less than 1%. Most of us have someplace around 5 liters of blood in our bodies. Now, if you're 6'4" and 280 pounds, you're going to have more than 5 liters of blood. And if you're 5'1" and 95 pounds, you're going to have significantly less than 5 liters of blood. The volume depends on the volume of the person. So oftentimes we centrifuge blood. It's one of the things that we look at. And when we centrifuge down the blood, so we take whole blood, spin it in a thing, all the heavy stuff goes to the bottom, so that's the red blood cells, or the hematocrit. The plasma stays on the top because it's liquid, and in between is this little thing called the buffy coat, and that's because it's buff colored, and that's the white blood cells and the platelets. So about 45%, less than 1%, and 55% is normal. Now, if you're a little dehydrated, that plasma volume goes down. If you've been mountain climbing, the hematocrit goes up because there's more red blood cells. So this is a breakdown of all of that, right? And so we're going to look at this chart again later. I think this is a good summary chart, not a place to start, but whatever. Of the blood plasma, there's the stuff that's dissolved in it. Right? There are proteins. 92% of it's water, 7% of it's proteins. All the rest of this stuff, therefore, make up about 1% of the plasma, 1% of the 55%. Of the proteins, there are 3 really important ones. albumin, globulin, and fibrinogen. So albumin is about maintaining osmosis, globulins are about fighting infections, and fibrinogen is about blood clotting. On the other side, we call them formed elements. Now these are cells. However, red blood cells don't have a nucleus and not too many organelles. Platelets are just cell fragments. So are these true cells? It's easier to call them formed elements. The only really true cells are the white blood cells. And there are 5 types of white blood cells. We'll talk about them more. But you'll notice that neutrophils make up the most, then lymphocytes, then monocytes, then eosinophils and basophils. It's never let monkeys eat bananas. Okay, red blood cells. Red blood cells are biconcave discs. They look just like the snow tubes at Snow Valley. And they're that way for this same reason. Because they're slippery, they don't catch on each other, they bounce off each other, and they have flexibility. So these are biconcave discs filled with hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a protein and iron combination that transports some carbon dioxide and most of the oxygen. So when oxygen joins onto hemoglobin, it's called oxyhemoglobin. When oxygen is not there, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is bright red, almost scarlet. Deoxyhemoglobin is darker, more of a purpley hue. Hence, the color of the blood in the veins is darker and not as scarlet. And that's because the hemoglobin has iron in it. And iron and oxygen together make rust, which is rusty colored and redder. And with no rust, it's more of a blue shade. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus. And because they don't have a nucleus, they can't undergo the cell life cycle. They don't undergo mitosis, and they can't make proteins after they're mature red blood cells. Before they're fully mature, RBCs, they can, and the proteins they make is mostly hemoglobin. They don't have any mitochondria because mitochondria use up oxygen, and red blood cells transport oxygen, so you don't want the cell to be using what it's transporting. Like you don't use dogs to deliver meat, you know. So they look like this. You notice that they're about 7.5 microns, and in diameter. That's going to come in handy when we talk about capillaries, because we're going to see that capillaries aren't much bigger than that. The reason that they're indented in the center is so there's more surface area per volume, because oxygen has to join onto the hemoglobin that's all in here. And if the hemoglobin in the center was further away, it would take longer to diffuse. This makes it efficient because all of this surface area means that no hemoglobin is very far from the surface. And so diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide is more efficient. Now, we have a lot. It's per cubic millimeter, so a microliter. There's 4 to 6 million cells in people. And the more you have, the better your ability to carry oxygen. So we pay a lot of attention to red blood cell counts. So if these cells can't undergo mitosis, they must come from someplace. They must have a protection facility. And producing red blood cells is something called erythropoiesis. In adults, well, actually after birth, anytime after birth, this happens in the red bone marrow. As long as there's red bone marrow, this is where it happens. They are made by stem cells that are found in the bone marrow, and these are called hematopoietic stem cells, or hemocytoblasts. Poiesis means the creation of. So hematopoietic means makes blood, creates blood. So these cells get made, they mature, they turn into red blood cells, but because they can't repair themselves, they have a limited lifespan. They go about 120 days. Someplace, around 4 months. On average. And the amount that are made depend on a hormone produced by the kidneys called erythropoietin. Now, the kidneys use an awful lot of oxygen to make ATP because there's a lot of active transport happens in the kidneys. So the kidneys, if they're not getting enough oxygen, don't make enough ATP to work properly. When oxygen levels are low, the kidneys want oxygen levels to go up. So anything that causes low amounts of oxygen getting to the kidneys causes the release of a hormone called erythropoietin. And erythropoietin, although it's made by the kidneys, it targets the red bone marrow to make hematopoietic stem cells become red blood cells. And so anything that lowers oxygen levels will do this. So you go to a high altitude, so you're mountain climbing, the partial pressure of oxygen is low, so therefore your kidneys will make you make more red blood cells. If you start exercising like crazy and you're using up oxygen faster than you can carry it to the cells, then the amount of oxygen available goes down, so you will grow more red blood cells. It's part of getting in shape is erythropoietin and low oxygen. If you have COPD, you're not breathing properly, you're not ventilating properly, then the kidneys will release erythropoietin. The other side of that is if you have kidney disease, you are probably not releasing enough erythropoietin and you are prone to anemia. So this is what the stem cells look like in the bone marrow. We're not that worried about it. If you follow this along, you'll see that the stem cell, the hematopoietic stem cell, depending on how it gets stimulated, will turn into a lymphoid or a myeloid stem cell. The lymphoid eventually becomes lymphocytes. The myeloid will become all of these things depending on what, so erythropoiesis makes it become to here, which makes it become a erythroblast, etc., and down to this. But the exact same cell can become a megakaryocyte, which is going to make platelets here, or it's going to be a monocyte, which turns into a macrophage, right? Or any of the granulocytes which is anything with fill, so eosinophil, basophil, or neutrophil. These are all related. They all come from these myeloid stem cells. So, low oxygen, the kidneys primarily, and to a lesser extent the liver. You release erythropoietin into the bloodstream, which targets the bone marrow, which makes the number of red blood cells go up, which increases the oxygen carrying capacity and inhibits the release of anything further. To make red blood cells, you need vitamin B12 and folic acid, and you need iron. Deficiency in anything that causes a deficiency in red blood cells is called anemia. Now, as the red blood cells age, they become less rubbery. They become stiffer and more fragile. And in the spleen, especially, in the liver a little bit, but in the spleen especially, the capillaries are about 7 microns in lumen, and the red blood cells about 7.5. So in order to get through the spleen, the red blood cells have to fold a little bit. They have to bend to get through. And if they're old and fragile, they can't bend, so they get stuck. And then macrophages grab hold of them and eat them. And what happens then is, as they eat them, the amino acids from the globin get released to be used again. The iron from the heme gets brought across to the liver where it's stored. And then the rest of the heme ends up getting excreted in the liver in the bile. So you reuse most of it, but there's some that doesn't. And when it's in the bile, it mixes and ends up being excreted in your feces. So that's the reason that no matter what color the food is that you eat, your poop is going to be brown because of this. So if we start, nutrients, go to the red bone marrow, you make red blood cells, old ones are removed, broken up, and recycled.